You ever get that feeling like you're at a concert, everyone's singing along,
Yeah.
and it's like this wave of unity, like you're part of something bigger? Makes you wonder if that's nationalism at play.
Hmm. Interesting.
It's been on my mind, especially with all this stuff about nationalism we're diving into. Definitions, history, even the Olympics. So much to unpack.
Right. It's a big topic.
So where do we even start with something as complex as nationalism? Right. Like, is it the same as just being part of a state or an ethnic group?
Exactly. Those terms get thrown around interchangeably, but they shouldn't. They mean different things.
Okay, definitions first then, before we get to the juicy stuff.
Absolutely. Got to have a strong foundation, right? Let's start with state. Think of it like a political entity, clear borders, a government, the whole shebang. But the key thing is a state has a monopoly on force.
Monopoly on force, meaning...
They're the only ones who get to use force, legitimately. Police inside the borders, military outside, control.
So basically, the state sets the rules and can enforce them within their territory.
Exactly. They're the rule makers, rule enforcers, the whole 9 yards.
Okay, that makes sense. So how is that different from an ethnic group then?
Ethnic group is all about shared identity. It's that feeling of belonging you get from a common ancestry, history, culture.
My family, we all come from the same region. We share all these stories.
Exactly. It's that shared story, where you come from, maybe where you're going, that binds an ethnic group.
So to use a real-world example, Jewish people around the world, that's an ethnic group. But Israel, the nation, is tied to a specific place.
Exactly. And that brings us to nation. Like an ethnic group, it has that shared identity, but it goes further. A nation sees itself tied to a specific homeland, a territory they believe is rightfully theirs.
So there's that added layer of claiming a physical space, not just a shared past.
Yes, and this is key. A nation wants political autonomy, maybe even full independence.
Shared identity is one thing, but wanting your own state, that's a whole other ballgame.
Absolutely, and this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because how do you define a nation? There's this term, imagined communities.
Imagined communities. Always found that a bit of a head-scratcher. How can millions, billions of people be an imagined community? You can't know everyone, right?
Exactly. It's a fascinating concept. This political scientist, Benedict Anderson, argued it's not about knowing everyone personally. It's more about shared symbols, stories that create the feeling of collective identity.
So even if I never meet every single person who shares my nationality, we can still feel connected because of our flag, our national anthem.
Exactly. Think about how you feel a sense of connection to other fans of your favorite sports team, even if you've never met them. Shared symbols, narratives, they create a mini imagined community. Scale that up to a whole nation, and you see how powerful it can be.
That's a really good point. Okay, so we've got states, ethnic groups, nations, all these different layers. When did this whole nation thing even start? Was it always around, or is it a more modern invention?
You've hit on one of the core debates in nationalism studies, two main camps, basically, the modernists and the ethno-symbolists.
Who are the modernists?
They argue that nations are relatively new, emerging alongside the modern state in the 18th and 19th centuries. They see states as almost manufacturing national identities.
You mean they just invented it out of thin air?
Well, not exactly. It's more like they took existing differences, regional identities, and created a sense of unity around a new national identity to consolidate power.
So, like, they're saying that something like Italian identity was created to unite a bunch of separate kingdoms and city-states, make it easier to rule them as one.
Exactly. Modernists would point to things like the standardization of language, national education systems as evidence.
Makes sense. Hard to unite people if they can't understand each other, let alone share a sense of belonging. But what about the other side, the folks who think nationalism goes way back?
That's the ethno-symbolists. They challenge the idea that it's purely modern. They argue national identities often draw on much older cultural ethnic ties, myths, symbols that predate the modern state.
It's like saying, you can't manufacture national feeling out of thin air. There have to be some existing threads of shared history, culture, a common narrative.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is how these pre-existing symbols can take on new meaning, become rallying points for national identity.
Got any examples of that?
One that really struck me was the English flag. It was, for a time, appropriated by certain groups with less than inclusive views.
Right.
But then it was reclaimed by football fans, showed how those pre-existing symbols can be reinterpreted, become a rallying point for a broader sense of national identity.
So it's not a clean-cut case of the state created the nation then. It's more this complex dance between the power of the state and these deeper cultural forces that are already there.
Exactly. That tension between existing cultural identities and the lines drawn by states, that's where things get really interesting when we look at how nationalism plays out in the real world.
Which is, I'm guessing, where borders come in. Because political boundaries and ethnic groups, they don't always line up neatly, do they?
You've hit on a major point of tension. That imperfect overlap creates a lot of friction in the world.
So many groups, identities, territories. It's a lot. It makes my head spin thinking about how messy things could get when those lines are blurry.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it happens all the time. Imagine you've got a significant minority group living within a larger state, but they have their own strong sense of culture, history.
Like, what if everyone in the U.S. who's super into brewing their own beer suddenly declared themselves a nation? The beer public of craft brewtopia or something demanded their own, like, hops-fueled state.
Love the image. And it highlights the dynamic perfectly. Take the Basque people in Spain, for example. They've got this unique language and culture, predates modern Spain by centuries.
Really?
Many identify very strongly with Basque nationalism, some even advocating for independence.
Wow. So even within countries that seem well-established, those tensions can still simmer below the surface?
Absolutely. It's not just a historical footnote either. These tensions are very much alive. And sometimes it's not even about a minority within an existing state, but the idea of a lost brethren.
Lost brethren.
Groups who feel connected to a homeland, right? But they feel it was unjustly taken from them or that they were separated.
Like the Irish unification movement. Perfect example of how those historical narratives keep fueling national sentiment for generations.
Exactly. The belief that there's a wrong that needs to be righted, that a nation isn't whole as long as its people or its perceived territory are divided. It's potent stuff driving political movements for centuries, even armed conflicts.
It's wild how a line on a map drawn generations ago can be so powerful. It gets so intertwined with identity, belonging, even people's sense of historical injustice. It's definitely more than just geography.
You're so right. It's a testament to how powerful those imagined communities really are, because it's not just about the physical space, it's the stories we tell about it, the meaning we pour into it. It's not always about separation, division.
Lots of nations manage to hold together, even with tons of different ethnicities and cultures within their borders.
Right. And when you have those diverse populations within a nation, you get into the whole concept of politically relevant ethnicity.
Okay, now that sounds complicated. Break that down for me.
It's the idea that people, we all have these different layers of identity, right? And which layer becomes important. Well, it depends on the context. It's about how our identities become important in different situations. Like you might identify as a podcast enthusiast with your friends, but in a political context, your identity as, say, an American citizen might matter more.
Ah, okay, I think I'm getting it. So in the U.S., always a melting pot. People have all these different threads of identity, but they're also connected by this overarching sense of being American.
Exactly. That's the balancing act of a multi-ethnic nation, making space for different cultures, but also cultivating that shared national identity. Nationalism isn't just borders and territory. There's this whole other layer, this emotional core tied to pride, shared history even, resentment over past wrongs.
Yeah, those words pride, humiliation kept popping up in the research. How do those fit into the big picture of nationalism?
They're two sides of the same coin, really. National pride, it can be this incredibly powerful unifying force. That feeling of shared accomplishment, of belonging to something significant, often a belief in the unique destiny of your nation.
Doesn't that sound like it could get a little dangerous? Like pride can turn into something less healthy pretty quickly if it's not kept in check.
Absolutely. That's where the humiliation part comes in.
And we've seen how that can play out even in the 21st century.
Exactly. It's not just history. It's a powerful way to rally support.
Yeah. And it makes you think, like, even something like the Olympics
Look how
that
this
can get
was.
caught up in all this. National pride, yeah. Maybe even a little humiliation if your team's not doing so well.
The Olympics are fascinating, right? Because on the surface, it's all about sportsmanship, international cooperation. But let's be real, there's a lot of national pride baked in.
Totally. I mean, you're trying to win for your country, right? Those medal counts, the flags, the anthems. Hard to deny there's something deeper going on there.
It's almost like the Olympics were designed to channel those feelings. The modern games, they were created to promote national strength and unity.
So are we basically being subtly influenced by all this every time we root for our team?
It's complicated, right? It's not just about cheering for an athlete.
Yeah.
But you're right, the Olympics, even with that message of global unity, they can't escape those undercurrents of national rivalry.
It's like these everyday things, flags, anthems, even certain foods, they take on this extra meaning. They're not just objects or songs anymore. They represent a whole set of values, beliefs, shared history.
Exactly. And that's why they're so powerful. But also why they can be so easily co-opted. Think about the English flag again, right?
Yeah.
We talk about how different groups have claimed it, each giving it their own spin.
It's like this battle over the narrative, almost. Who gets to define what these symbols mean? Whose version of national identity wins out?
Absolutely. And that's part of what makes nationalism so fascinating to study, but also so challenging, right? History, culture, politics, emotion, it's all tangled up together.
What's the big takeaway for you? What do you hope our listeners will walk away with?
I think the biggest thing is to remember that nationalism, it's not simple. It's not inherently good or bad. It can be a powerful force, for better or worse. So we need to be able to recognize it in its different forms, understand its history.
Be aware of how it can unite us, but also divide us. So be informed, be engaged, maybe even be a little skeptical the next time you see those flags waving.
Question those easy answers.
Because understanding nationalism, its nuances, its potential pitfalls, feels like it's more important now than ever, doesn't it?
Couldn't agree more.
Well, on that note, listeners, one final thought for you to ponder. If nationalism can be so easily manipulated, used to inspire, but also to divide, then what does that mean for building a more just and equitable world? It's a question worth wrestling with.